The modern soldier is already a far cry from their ancient counterparts, but as technology advances, we may be on the verge of a new era, one where warriors are not just trained, but engineered for battle. Welcome back to Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur for another Sci-Fi Sunday, where we explore a popular concept in science fiction, examine the pathways to it through science, and contemplate what such technologies might look like upon deeper reflection. Today's topic is Space Marines, the first half of our exploration of elite soldiers of the future of the spring. Next month's Sci-Fi Sunday will focus on Stormtroopers, and while both episodes will examine a wide variety of examples in science fiction, each will pay tribute to a specific setting. This month's featuring the Adeptus Astartes of Warhammer 40,000, and next month highlighting the Stormtroopers and Clone Troopers of Star Wars, to celebrate our 501st episode, though deep looks at either will be toward the end of the episodes. Somewhat ironically, the first time we see Stormtroopers in Star Wars, they are acting as a Marine boarding party on a Rebel Corvette, but we will still save them for next episode. When we think of the term Space Marines, images of genetically enhanced super soldiers, towering power armor, and high-tech weaponry instantly come to mind. Science fiction has long explored the concept of specialized troops trained and equipped for battle in the hostile environment of space. Today, we'll delve into what makes Space Marines tick, the science and logistics of their existence, and how they might actually operate in realistic scenarios. We'll also look at famous examples from science fiction, from genetically enhanced warriors to cybernetic combatants, and consider how boarding actions on spaceships or space stations might unfold. What are Space Marines? At their core, Space Marines are soldiers adapted to fight in space or extraterrestrial environments. Traditionally, Marines are the infantry component of a naval force used for boarding ships, repelling boarding parties, and seizing ports or islands, often to make a beachhead for a larger invasion force. In space, we tend to assume this would mean seizing space stations, boarding other spaceships, and probably invading asteroid bases or space habitats. Now, that's the classic meaning, and it really is not the case anymore these days with US Marines, which have adapted into a more wide-spectrum force and grown in size, while many other nations have kept the role limited to the classic role or possibly expanded it to semi-ceremonial functions like guarding embassies or monuments. I should probably say from the outset that we'll be using the classic baseline, but assuming a lot of expanded roles as options today, and that we're not trying to project the US Marine Corps or the UK's Royal Marines into the year 4000 or 40,000, or to get into any inter-service rivalries and debates today. I have a lot of respect for my cousins in the Marine Corps. I've worked with them and even been in charge of an entire platoon of them on a few occasions, way back in Iraq. And of course, I think all of us grunts in the Army are better line troops than the Marines on general principle, but they are solid professionals to have at your back, and definitely not someone you want in front of you charging your way. Semper Fi, cousins. This episode is dedicated to all our jarheads out there. So, Marines of the future might be specialized along classic lines or more broad than even now, and likely there will be thousands of various space nations which had them in a variety of different roles or none. Maybe just call them shipboard security, or having some other type of commando or shock troops, even just robots. We have no way to guess what the norm in the future might be, but the usual science fiction reasoning is that you are only getting from planet to planet with space navies, and they presumably carry Marines on board. And it being science fiction, battle is inevitable and needs to be cool and futuristic. So we see a lot of examples of them being augmented in some fashion. Whether through genetic engineering, cybernetic enhancements, or advanced exoskeletal armor, they represent the pinnacle of combat capability. These soldiers often serve as elite units, tasked with missions too dangerous, specialized, or tactically critical for standard forces. Key attributes of Space Marines in fiction often include 1. Genetic enhancement, enhanced strength, speed, endurance, reflexes, and even intelligence. 2. Cybernetic implants, integrated weaponry, augmented senses, or even AI-linked neural interfaces. 3. Power armor, armored suits that provide life support, augmented strength, advanced targeting systems, and protection from radiation or vacuum, and also bullets. And 4. Specialized training, expertise in zero-gravity combat, planetary assaults, and ship boarding operations. As mentioned, this is a big topic that we're splitting between this episode and next month's Stormtroopers episode, at least in terms of reviewing well-known science fiction examples of super soldiers. For instance, we will save discussions of Star Wars Stormtroopers and Clone Troopers for that episode, along with examples like the Sardaukar or Fremen from Dune. With that in mind, topics like cloning super soldiers or recruiting from death wards like Seleucus Secundus or Dune will be covered next time. That said, even our main case today, the Adeptus Astartes, often recruited from death wards, though this wasn't universal for all legions. Today, we'll focus more on augmentation and training, though we've covered some of those aspects in our Super Soldiers episode a couple of years ago. We'll also skip the specifics of deploying troops from a ship to the ground, as we explored that topic in our Drop Troops episode a few years back. That episode also covered one of the classic science fiction cases, Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, which inspired many other stories and depicted regular humans with powerful battle armor and elite training. The same is the case for the Colonial Marines from the 1986 film Aliens, well trained and well equipped, though neither to the degree described in the novel Starship Troopers. They are more on par with the mobile infantry we see in the 1997 Starship Troopers film, which for those of us who were fans of both, we just treat as a nice popcorn action flick that has the same name as the utterly unrelated novel by Robert Heinlein. The Colonial Marines from Aliens fit the franchise, gritty, pragmatic, and expendable soldiers equipped with pulse rifles, flamethrowers, and motion trackers. While we do see them with both a dropship and an armored personnel carrier, they are acting principally as light infantry in the film, presumably on the ground they're operating inside a friendly facility that the monstrous xenomorphs have taken over, and that they don't want to go blowing holes in with tanks and artillery. And that's an important note, because when operating on an alien planet, there's a good chance down the other side of a wall is a toxic atmosphere, or a vacuum, as we would expect in space battles on ships or stations. So the traditional wisdom is that you should use low penetration weapons so as not to blow holes in your ship, and for this reason heavy armor might actually be effective since forces resisting you are trying not to shoot holes through their own ship. That's mostly valid reasoning, but a couple of notes are needed. First, a bullet hole in the side of your ship is not going to result in all your atmosphere immediately blowing out, let alone people being sucked into space. If you want to get a sense of how bad even a high caliber hole in the wall should be, put your hand over your vacuum cleaner's intake port. While it's not a true vacuum, it's pretty close in functional terms. A small patch slapped over the hole, or even a balloon deployed in the area to get sucked into the hole, would seal it just fine. Just use a material that won't tear or pop too easily. What's more, a bullet hole isn't that big. Even a 9mm round, which is fairly large, has a cross-section of just 0.64 square centimeters. The standard 5.56mm rifle round, used in M16s and M4s, which is basically a .22 caliber round, has a cross-section of just 0.24 centimeters squared, while the larger 7.62mm round has 0.46 square centimeters. People often assume rifle bullets are larger, which is true for length of cartridge, but pistol rounds tend to be slower due to the shorter barrel and compensate with wider bullets. For comparison, a .45 caliber round, 0.45 inches wide, has a cross-section of 1.03 square centimeters. These bullets might leave slightly larger holes, especially as exit wounds, but in general, air escapes through holes at roughly the speed of sound. As pressure drops, so does the speed, primarily due to decreasing temperature. Practically speaking, as the air thins out, the leakage slows down. Even though this is a sci-fi Sunday, I wouldn't want to miss the chance to include some science. Air leakage is governed by the Hagen-Poiseuille flow or empirical leak rate equations. The flow rate, Q, in liters per second is approximately Q equals 278 times A times delta P, where A is the hole's area in centimeters squared, and delta P is the pressure difference in atmospheres, 1 atmosphere in this case, with both factors being 1 for a 1 centimeter square hole. We get 278 liters per second, 16,680 liters per minute, 1,800,000 liters per hour, about 1,000 cubic meters per hour. For context, a 10-meter cube, about 33 feet on its side, contains roughly 1 million liters of air. That means a room of this size would take about an hour to drain completely, but in reality would take longer since the leakage rate drops as the pressure decreases. There's 1,000 liters in a cubic meter, 28 liters in a cubic foot, so a hole in your ship is no laughing matter, but also not a state of panic. Of course, a few thousand bullet holes might be a different matter. For context, a modern assault rifle or squad automatic light machine gun can fire multiple rounds per second. Science fiction often suggests even higher rates of fire, but I would assume a preference for smarter or more powerful rounds rather than a spray and pray strategy, especially in an environment where bullets are either going to ricochet or punch holes in an airproof wall or hull. And even the invader has little reason for overkill here, as if you just want to do raw damage, you shoot the ship with a torpedo, or you deploy a boarding party but fire grenades or send in bomb drones ahead of you. Now, the other half of the equation is assuming a bullet will go through the wall. That's likely true for armor-piercing rounds on interior walls, as you'd want them to be air-proof, but there's not much reason to make them excessively thick. It's generally better to add extra thickness and mass to the outer hull, where the additional strength and radiation shielding benefit the entire interior, rather than distributing it evenly among interior walls, which would expose some areas to more radiation simply because they're closer to the exterior. That said, interior walls would still contribute to overall protection, and you would likely have bunkers or vault spaces with extra armor. You may also have, on bigger ships, large segments that had reinforced walls between them, even if most other walls were thin. However, in most cases, you'd want the majority of that armor concentrated on the outer hull for maximum protection of the entire ship. Looking at 5 to 6 inches, 12 to 15 centimeters of steel would provide comfortable gamma ray shielding. However, in practice you'd likely use a thicker, layered, wafered structure filled with water or another substance better suited for cosmic ray shielding, especially since you need a stockpile of such materials anyway. For those unfamiliar with modern firearms, you could empty entire magazines of pistol or assault rifle ammo into a 1-inch thick steel plate and not puncture it. Something heavier like a 50 caliber machine gun can barely penetrate a 1-inch plate, and an armor-piercing round typically doubles penetration depth at best. It's quite possible that many ships wouldn't carry much armor at all, or would have unarmored sections, especially cargo ships like ice freighters, where you might as well coat the outside with the cargo itself. But any area meant to be both shielded and armored would be tough enough that you could have firefights there without worrying about punching holes through the outer hull, even with armor-piercing rounds. The inner walls are another matter. Every corridor has 2 sides, at least one of which is not an armored exterior, not to mention floors and ceilings, and if it's a rotating section for artificial gravity, the floor is where the armor is concentrated. Since our main example of Space Marines today are the 8-foot-tall Adeptus Astartes, it is reasonable to consider people walking around firing more powerful weapons and carrying thicker armor, and that armor might be able to shrug off anything short of a nuke without even getting into Clark Tech arms and armor. Of course, the mobile infantry of Starship Troopers were equipped with tactical nukes and advanced targeting systems for planetary invasions, not to mention jump jets. We could also have weapons firing bullets at vastly higher speeds than conventional firearms, such as the Gauss cannons from the StarCraft franchise used by the Terran Marines, which I assume are electromagnetic catapults of some type. Speed alone doesn't guarantee armor penetration, only raw kinetic energy, but generally the faster a projectile moves, the deeper it will penetrate. Using denser materials also helps, though in general armor is also made from dense materials, so it's a constant arms race. However, depleted uranium, DU, is a lot safer to shoot than to wear. Depleted uranium isn't just pure uranium-238, which is relatively harmless due to its long half-life. It's actually whatever remains after uranium enrichment, meaning it contains small amounts of more radioactive isotopes that could not be profitably removed. As a result, depleted uranium is always somewhat more radioactive than pure U-238, though even U-238 itself is radioactive, with a half-life of several billion years. But the point of bullets is that armor capable of resisting them gets very heavy, since it needs to cover the entire body, while a bullet only needs to penetrate a fingernail-sized spot. This is where exoskeletons and power armor become useful, as seen in films like Edge of Tomorrow or with the Martian Marines in The Expanse. At the end of the day though, while power armor is awesome, at a certain point you either use straight-up robots or consider improving the folks inside the suits too. Make them faster, stronger, tougher of mind and body, supermen who will know no fear. One of the best known examples today are the Spartans from Halo. superhumans engineered for combat, complete with reinforced bones, enhanced healing, and extreme pain resistance. This serves as a reminder that wearing power armor doesn't mean you can't also benefit from cybernetics and genetic enhancements. Cybernetics could range from something minor, like Luke Skywalker's prosthetic hand, to something extreme, like brains encased in armored vaults inside war machines, as seen with the Titans from the Butlerian Jihad in Dune. Cybernetic augmentation could also be minimalist, such as wires woven through the nervous system to speed up reflexes, potentially including thousands of miles of microscopic cables while weighing just a few grams. On the genetic engineering front, enhancements could range from selective breeding and eugenics programs to outright fusing alien organs into humans. Science fiction is full of examples of such modifications. One memorable case is The Soldiers from the movie Soldier, starring Kurt Russell, where multiple generations of improved warriors are developed, leaving earlier ones obsolete. Another is the symbiote from Spider-Man, a parasitic alien that first bonds with Peter Parker as a suit before later forming Venom and Carnage. Of course, Spider-Man himself was famously bitten by a radioactive spider, and many of his enemies have undergone similar genetic alterations. The Marvel universe is filled with examples of genetic engineering, from Captain America's super soldier serum to the mutants of the X-Men, as well as numerous cyborgs and power armor users. The same for DC and other comic book universes. This kind of engineering could be especially important for Marines operating in space, as their traditional role of boarding enemy ships, stations, or space habitats becomes even more challenging. To successfully breach an enemy vessel, they need to get inside without being destroyed first. Additionally, they must be dangerous enough that using an equal weight of explosives wouldn't be just as effective. After all, those explosives wouldn't necessarily need to detonate at the point of entry. They could instead be launched as independent missiles or drones from the nose of the boarding torpedo they arrived on. Why didn't they just use robots is always a tricky question in science fiction, and the answer is almost always because we want human characters to relate to, which explains storytelling choices but does not necessarily predict science fact or the actual future very well. This issue becomes even more complicated in space, where outside of Star Trek and other old-school sci-fi shows, where ships simply parked next to each other on a shared set and fired weapons, realistic engagement ranges would likely be thousands of kilometers or miles apart. Anyone attempting to board another ship would need to accelerate rapidly to match trajectories while also avoiding getting shot en route. It's common in fiction to give boarding pods some kind of inertial dampening system, but in reality, we don't have that technology. Both humans and advanced robots struggle with high G-forces, so simply replacing Marines with robots wouldn't necessarily solve the problem, though a machine built specifically to handle extreme acceleration, or a genetically modified superhuman, might. Ideally, boarding actions happen at very high speeds, either by ramming straight through the hull, as seen with the Space Marine boarding torpedoes, or by attaching to the side and cutting through. A great example of this appears in the Babylon 5 episode Several Dreams, where an invasion force uses boarding pods that magnetically attach to the station before cutting through the hull. In that scenario, since Babylon 5 is a rotating space habitat, the boarding force ends up cutting through the heavily armored floor and climbing up into the station, putting them in an extremely disadvantageous position. It's one of the best episodes of the series, and it even won a Hugo Award, beating out Star Trek First Contact, Independence Day, and Mars Attacks, which was stiff competition. Fun fact, Jerry Doyle, who played Mr. Garibaldi, actually broke his arm and wrist while filming the combat sequence. Space habitats are challenging places to fight in. In the case of a small rotating habitat, the floor curves upward in both directions along a corridor, limiting line of sight, and really messing with who has the high ground. Additionally, these environments are likely to be filled with bulkheads and airlocks, creating natural choke points. And the station belongs to a militant culture rather than a peaceful Star Trek-style federation. You can assume the walls and ceilings are rigged with Claymore-style mines, automated turrets, and other defensive measures. Even if humans, whether genetically enhanced super soldiers, cyborgs, or baseline troops, are part of the battle, robots would almost certainly play a major role. Space habitats likely have corridors designed for wheeled vehicles, at least golf cart sized, to transport cargo and perform maintenance. It's very likely that armored versions of these vehicles exist, even if they're just golf carts with steel plating and a mounted machine gun. Before troops even enter a battle zone, waves of drones would likely lead the charge. Even infantry on foot would likely have robotic shields walking ahead of them, with support bots crawling behind, carrying spare ammo or battery packs. On the battlefield of the future, who or what will be fighting? As machines take over warfare, will there come a day when there are no humans left at all, on or off the battlefield? That's exactly the kind of unsettling question we explore in my Nebula exclusive episode, Post-Consciousness Civilizations, which begins with the story of humanity's first encounter with aliens. What happens when intelligence and warfare no longer require a single conscious being? Could entire civilizations exist as armies of autonomous machines, continuing conflicts long after their original creators have vanished? Our topic today, Space Marines, are at the center of some of the most compelling sci-fi stories ever written, and if you enjoy thought-provoking sci-fi, don't forget to check out The Sojourn, an original Nebula series that explores the farthest reaches of deep space, where survival depends not just on technology, but on whether the crew can truly trust each other. Find out more exclusively on Nebula, where you can watch all my episodes early and ad-free, along with all our other monthly Nebula exclusives. Head to go.nebula.tv/IsaacArthur to get Nebula for $36 a year. That's 40% off using my link, and start exploring the future of intelligence, warfare, and the unknown. It's something of a running joke in sci-fi that senior NCOs and officers are often portrayed as frontline soldiers, with hardly any low-ranking troops appearing at all. You might see one lone corporal or sergeant, who in real life would be leading a squad or fire team, not just serving as one of its members. However, this could be an accurate depiction of future warfare. A single human might command a squad of a dozen battlebots, each designed for different combat roles, with a human acting more as a coordinator and a tactical decision-maker than just another rifleman. They also have some modularity. For example, air tanks take up space, so rather than carrying a large one, it would be more practical to have a small, replaceable tank the drone could fly in to swap or recharge as needed. Similarly, in zero-gravity or open-space combat, a jump pack or jetpack would be extremely useful. However, instead of permanently wearing one, which adds bulk and increases exposure to shrapnel and damage, it would be far more efficient if the jetpack itself were a detachable drone that could clip onto the user when needed, rather than something they had to carry at all times. Self-propelled artillery, but at a smaller and wider scale. Self-propelled equipment and supplies. You are a knight with many robot squires and footmen, and we'll be looking at space feudalism later this summer too. It also has to be acknowledged that while swords, shields, and other medieval-style weapons are usually impractical in sci-fi, they make a lot more sense for boarding parties operating in tight, confined corridors. In close-quarters combat, where visibility is limited and firearms risk breaching hulls or damaging critical systems, melee weapons can be surprisingly effective. Something many people overlook is that striking someone with an axe delivers energy and damage comparable to a pistol or even a rifle. If we assume augmented or enhanced soldiers are wielding these weapons, they could be swinging axes or mauls 10 times heavier than what an unmodified human could handle at several times the speed. This could result in hundreds of times more destructive force, enough to penetrate the armor on even a main battle tank. So yes, the idea of a squad of futuristic feudal knights clad in half a ton of depleted uranium armor storming a space station with warhammers and storm shields, supported by hundreds of spider bots, battle droids, and gun drones, is entirely plausible. Speaking of Warhammer, no discussion of Space Marines would be complete without mentioning the dreaded Adeptus Astartes of Warhammer 40,000. This tabletop game, which I started playing in the late 1990s, was already in its second edition, with the third edition on the way at the time. Even then, Space Marines had undergone significant power creep compared to their original form in Rogue Trader. In that first iteration, they were far less like knights in space, and more like criminals and convicts, brainwashed and pumped full of combat drugs and aggression enhancers to turn them into lethal shock troops. The game is now in its 10th edition, last I checked, and while the lore has changed significantly, I think the newer version is an improvement, though the old school setting has its own nostalgia appeal. Back then I played the Imperial Guard, the standard human military, a Mordian armored company for those curious, so I always found the other factions a bit overpowered and eye-rolling to begin with. The idea of soldiers juiced up on combat drugs is also a popular sci-fi trope, seen in games like Rifts, the post-apocalyptic RPG from the late 80s and 90s. In Rifts, you could also wear power armor, become a cyborg, or battle supernatural monsters and demons, similar to Warhammer 40k. Both settings are full of mutants, aliens, and supernatural monsters, requiring superhuman soldiers that can be a bulwark against such terrors, defenders of humanity, and know no fear. A lot of the Space Marine aesthetic in Warhammer 40k likely comes from the 1989 board game Space Hulk, where we see even more heavily armored Terminators boarding derelict ships or Space Hulks to battle Tyranids, specifically Gene Stealers. These creatures were presumably inspired by the Xenomorphs from Alien, designed by H.R. Giger, whose terrifying biomechanical aesthetic looked like it came straight from a fever dream or nightmare. The Aliens franchise wasn't the only influence, though. These creatures are also very similar to the alien bugs in Starship Troopers, the film, not the book, and the Zerg from StarCraft, both of which came later. That said, if you plan to fight something like that, the best approach is probably to be an 8-foot-tall superhuman covered in half a ton of armor and carrying a weapon designed to destroy vehicles, or nightmarish abominations. Eye-rolling power creep aside, the combat prowess of Warhammer 40k's Space Marines is actually well justified. They undergo hypno-indoctrination, not just to ensure absolute loyalty, but also to train them in countless skills. They require very little sleep, living on an intense 20-hour daily regimen of constant training when not in combat. This makes them incredibly skilled and knowledgeable warriors. On top of that, they are an ultra-valuable asset, worth far more than their weight in gold, and are insanely expensive to produce with an absurd failure rate that, depending on lore, ranges from most candidates dying to less than 1% surviving. So they receive the finest weapons, armor, and support personnel available, once ready for the field. The real secret to their power, though, is biological augmentation. Space Marines are implanted with extra organs and glands, giving them abilities far beyond normal humans, including a second heart for increased endurance and redundancy, enhanced muscle fibers and thicker bones for superior strength and resilience, neural and motor enhancements for faster reflexes, the ability to spit acid as a weapon, which always seemed a weird add-on to me, and the ability to consume a fallen enemy's brain to absorb their memories and knowledge. In short, they aren't just genetically enhanced super soldiers, they are walking war machines, custom built for battle at every level. They even possess an aura of transhuman dread, which makes sense. If you see something huge moving with unbelievable speed, your instinctive reaction should be terror. The Warhammer 40,000 universe features plenty of other genetic engineering as well, from the even more elite Adeptus Custodes to wealthy or powerful individuals enhancing themselves with implanted glands. There are also genetically engineered but more conventional human troops, demonstrating that bioaugmentation is not limited to the Space Marines alone. A couple months back in our Gravity Tech episode, I even gave an example where one of their Primarchs, who are them dialed up a couple more levels in size and awesomeness, gets blown into space without a helmet and keeps fighting. And that's something you definitely want in your Space Marines, protection against vacuum exposure. Bullets might not punch massive holes in a ship, but explosives certainly could. In fact, a common defensive tactic might be to blow sections of the hull open to deal with intruders. Space Marines would, of course, be wearing pressurized suits, but in a firefight with shrapnel and bullets flying everywhere, those suits are likely to take hits. A small puncture in a spacesuit would vent air much faster than a large cargo hold depressurizing, making vacuum resistance a critical feature of any boarding force's gear. This could be handled in several ways: protective film over the eyes, like an extra transparent eyelid, a sphincter in the throat that could clamp shut to prevent air from escaping the lungs, drones or automated medical systems that could slam a mask onto a wounded soldier's face in an emergency, kinda like the facehugger from Alien but with air tags. A diamond-tipped wide-bore needle that could pierce armor and directly inject oxygen into the lungs while extracting carbon dioxide might be a thing too. Indeed, the Space Marine medics have equipment along those lines. Most humans only use about a pound of oxygen per day, so if a soldier had an implant, machine, or even an engineered organ that could scrub carbon dioxide, they could go a long time without needing to breathe. With a lung capacity around 6 liters, an individual could last several minutes, and much longer if they are breathing pure oxygen beforehand. We can imagine a civilization that favors genetics or cybernetics over robotics, and it might not even be a moral issue. Even if they care about human casualties from an ethical perspective, they might routinely perform brain backups on troops before battle, with the intention of restoring them in a cloned body later. While I do think military vessels would have marine contingents, I believe the more common form of genetic engineering would be among the regular crew members. Many would likely spend their extra pay on enhancements, not just for safety or efficiency in their jobs, but also to make themselves tougher, smarter, or simply because they looked cool or were fun. The Ultras from the Interstellar Ships and Alastair Reynolds' Revelation Space series are a great example of that. Sailors were notorious for their tattoos in past generations, especially when tattoos were still socially frowned upon. In a futuristic setting, the equivalent of tattoos and body piercings could be various augmentations, a gland that enhances perception or suppresses fear and anxiety, or a reinforced spine with a high-speed nervous system upgrade, blending functionality with personal expression. I mentioned Rogue Trader earlier. These were galactic exploration and trading vessels miles long, and one of the interesting things about those ships is that while they have huge crews, they are still amazingly massive and highly automated, leaving a lot of empty space. Many of these vessels are also extremely old, having been in service for thousands of years, which would likely be the norm for interstellar trade ships in a non-FTL universe, like the one we seem to live in. And again, Revelation Space gives us a great example of these in their subculture, as does the original Rogue Trader from 40K, but with FTL and space demons. These ships often contain museums of trophies and gear collected over centuries, and I could easily see something similar happening in a realistic interstellar setting. This also makes stealing an interstellar spaceship a highly valuable and common crime. Not only are they worth a fortune, but they're also filled with valuables. Because of this, it's likely that crews take security very seriously, with vaults of weapons and battle bots stored throughout the ship, possibly lots of illegal tech they've collected and can get away with using in the interstellar equivalent of international waters. If they don't have dedicated security forces or marines, who would need to be paid to mostly sit around, they likely train themselves during long voyages. Many crew members might even invest in augmentations, both for self-defense and to improve their capabilities during operations. As we've seen, the idea of super soldiers, power armor, genetic enhancements, and cybernetic warfare is far from just science fiction. Many of these concepts are rooted in plausible advancements in biotechnology, engineering, and battlefield strategy, even if we're still a long way from deploying true space marines. That said, there's a lot more to explore in the realm of futuristic infantry, and next month we'll be looking at stormtroopers, the more mass-produced, expendable counterpart to the elite warriors we discussed today. Whether it's Star Wars, Warhammer 40,000, or real-world developments, there's a fine balance between quantity and quality in warfare, one that will define the soldiers of the future. And while Warhammer 40,000's Adeptus Astartes may be an over-the-top fantasy of 8-foot-tall transhuman warriors clad in a ton of armor and wielding guns that would normally require a vehicle mount, there are still many things surprisingly grounded about them. The biological enhancements, power armor, and psychological conditioning they undergo aren't just for show. They reflect many real-world military principles taken to their absolute extreme. Whether or not we ever see warriors like them in the real world, the ideas behind them remain fascinating to explore. Ultimately, war may evolve, but one thing remains constant. On the battlefield, the best weapons are the ones that keep you alive, and that includes your own body, regular or extra augmented. And the future is likely to hold many different pathways and options for that. But whatever may arrive in time, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for another Sci-Fi Sunday here on SFIA, and until next time, have a great week.